What if the stories that are meant to wake us up are actually not only putting us to sleep, but keeping us asleep? I want to read something. Symbolic violence operates in a disguised way. It is not perceived as violence because it is embedded in systems of meaning that are taken for granted. Now, what does that mean? We get our answer from the same author. This form of violence becomes most effective when individuals internalize cultural meanings and social expectations that sustain asymmetrical power relations. In other words, symbols meant for wisdom or unity can be subtly transformed into tools of dominance. If we're finding ourselves put off from our former religious conversation, if we are finding ourselves unable to find a sustained amount of an experience for a sustained amount of understanding, to build up a sustained amount of devotional intellect, it's because our prior experience filled with symbol, filled with myth, has done something to override our rational intellectual capabilities to set aside ourselves from that. What does that mean? What symbolic violence? Is there an example? Going into the book of Genesis 22, 1 and 2, came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. He said, Take your son, Isaac, who you love, get to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell you of. Now, this can be seen as a story of faith, yet it normalizes sacrificial obedience to authority, despite one's conscience, despite one's integrity. If there is a religious authority telling you to sacrifice something of yourself or to sacrifice something of another, you must do it. And if it is an authority with the backing of another authority, whether that be secular, whether that be temporal or non-temporal, it's going to make it feel as though that needs to be something that one should do. Looked at or interpreted in another way, it's basically saying that faith, quote unquote faith, is an obligation that one must give to figures or to deity that one holds in authority. Said in another way, it can be looked at as quote unquote faith for the purpose of submission to religious authority. Whether that religious authority is coming from some sort of priestly figure, or whether one believes that that priestly figure is backed by a supernatural priestly or deity figure, submission via faith, via or through authority is the lesson that one must submit themselves and their conscience to, and this is supposed to be by quote-unquote faith in order to be accounted worthy, in order to be accounted faithful, in order to be accounted well, not just in the earthly community, but in the community beyond the earth. Another example, 1 Corinthians 6:19. What? Know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own? Now, while this is really well to believe that your body is the temple to be inhabited by quote-unquote Holy Ghost, in reality it makes absolutely no sense why something that is not flesh-based would want to count your body, your literal physical body, as being its home, its temple. While this can sound appealing on the surface, when you actually crunch down the figurative illustration of what this actually means, this actually gives preference to religious codes and to religious laws. Because if your physical body is supposed to be inhabited by some supernatural entity and their ghostly, ghastly figure, well, then that means that your body needs to be regulated in a specific way. And that regulation can only come by religious law, religious code. So again, while the figurative illustration is used to get a positive message out, when we're hearing these things, it connotes a reaction and a response that falls back down to us psychologically, and then it works subconsciously to allow us to understand or to let us know how we are supposed to behave, whether or not we realize it or not. And I think this touches on something else, another passage that I want to read. Cynicism appears where enlightenment becomes self-aware of its failure, yet continues its practices with ironic detachment. Now, enlightenment is supposed to lead to reason, to purpose, and to progress. If we are taking enlightenment in the stories and in the myths that we are hearing, theological and religious, it should lead to freedom, to purpose, and to resigning self in a way where a fulfillment of self on a greater platform, leaving the previous plateau and moving on to a plateau higher can take place. But that does not seem to be the case. It does not seem that through the myths that we have at this present time and times prior, and through the symbolic imagery within them, we're not moving toward progress, toward freedom, toward reason, toward understanding. In a weird way, we are shaping the things and the myths and the symbols that we are hearing according to our own perception, and we are dying in them. We are repeating these myths in a bit of an ironic way, because as we are supposed to be taking these things that we're hearing, these stories, and using them as a way to transform our thoughts, feelings, actions, and behaviors, we're actually doing the opposite. They are ruining our thoughts, feelings, actions, and behaviors because they are subconsciously connoting a way of behavior through the illustration of the story themselves, of which, if it is not closely looked at, if we are not closely regulating how we look at these things, well, we can lose ourselves in them, of which we are experiencing. To live the myth, which is why they're given, which is why they're culturally given, to live the myth is to live self. To live the myth is to live self, which means that beneath the illustration is an illustration, beneath that illustration and beneath that illustration is an illustration that when one understands it, self is to manifest in a new way. And the impact of that myth upon that self across individuals, it's going to be different. Same impact, same significance, same inward work. But when that myth becomes institutionalized, when it becomes dogmatized, well, then self is taken out of the equation and it is replaced by a constitutional government, a constitutional spiritual government. No longer is self supposed to be enlightened by the myth. Self is supposed to be suppressed by the myth. And in so doing, losing self by myth through institution, causing the experience, human and devotional, to ultimately perish. Which leads into this final passage. The Western conception of religion has constituted a normative and often violent imposition of a specific epistemological model on the ways of being. Initially, where we have gone to from us taking on myth, these ideas and these characters within these illustrations that we take literally, but the culture themselves are not. Western religion does the complete opposite of what is psychologically beneficial for the individual devotional character, which is to look at the myth as representing a symbol unfolding self. When we're not doing that, we're going to feel a lot of pain. When we're only having the myth propound something, when we're only having the superstition as an article of truth, when in reality, the myth, the superstition, the symbol, the characters therein, they're not truth. That's not truth. It's not real. The truth, the reality, is what is beneath the myth, because once you get to that, that is what is supposed to unfold the consciousness of self and to work within the subconscious of that consciousness within that self to understand the kind of devotional experience and the kind of philosophical devotional experience that the individual should have for themselves personally. we are ruining ourselves the more that we continue to take these myths to be the fact that they are not. The authors never constructed them to be fact. The characters were never intended to be real. It's just as when you go to the movies and you see characters in the movies, you know that's not real, right? Well, we're going through, when we look at these myths, the 2025 version of the 2,000 years ago AD, 5,000 years ago BC movie theater. Nothing was ever intended to be real or legitimate. The only real or legitimate aspect to them is the rising and the stirring of the self within the individual that is willing to plunge within them, so that we are no longer taking these symbols as our violence. These symbols are no longer becoming violent towards us. We are now causing violence to them. And causing violence to them means picking them apart, scrutinizing them, and allowing what is within them to grow what is within us. So what are we doing? Are we letting our belief actually live, or is what we believe doing the living for us? So this idea of the violence behind symbols, symbolic violence to the conscience of our human and devotional conscience, isn't about getting rid of symbols. Human beings communicate through stories. Human beings communicate through narrative. Narrative tells the psychological script that is going on, that is relatable throughout every single time period of life. But there's a difference between the narrative script and that only being just that, and understanding it as it is, and then taking the narrative script and making it real, to where what is now real becomes the standard for what is to be understood as quote-unquote faith. So we're taking narrative and we're transforming it into a religious standard. Are we living our belief, or are we doing something to have our belief live for us? Just something to think about as we go throughout our journey of making sense of this human and devotional experience for the benefit not just simply of us, but also to the people around us.